Mother-in-law called my husband a grease monkey at our own dinner table. He said it with a smile like it was a compliment wrapped in a joke, and then he looked right at me and said, "You could have done better, sweetheart." That was the night I realized the next 3 years of holidays were going to be a very particular kind of war. My husband Elliot. Wait, no. Let me back up, because if I start there, you won't understand why it took me as long as it did to finally say enough. His name is Brennan. We met when I was 26 at a conference of all places. I was there covering it for the nonprofit I worked for. He was there presenting a paper. Not as a keynote, nothing flashy. He was just one of maybe 40 engineers in a breakout room on the second floor of a Marriott in Columbus, Ohio, talking about load-bearing systems and seismic retrofitting to about 30 people who actually cared. I wandered in because I had 40 minutes to kill before my next session, and the title on the conference board said something about structural failure in residential builds. I thought it would be boring. It was the most interesting 40 minutes of my week. He didn't try to impress me afterward. That was the thing. Most guys at those events hand you a business card before they even ask your name. Brennan asked if I wanted coffee and then spent 20 minutes asking about my work like he genuinely wanted to know. He was a structural engineer. He had his own small firm. Just him and 2 other engineers and a part-time project manager. And he specialized in older buildings, the kind that developers wanted to tear down and Brennan wanted to save. He had this whole philosophy about it. Historic preservation wasn't just sentimental, he said. Half the buildings from the early 20th century were built with materials and techniques that modern construction couldn't replicate cheaply. If you knew what you were working with, you could reinforce them for a fraction of the cost of new builds, and they'd outlast anything going up today. I thought he was passionate and a little nerdy, and I found both of those things completely attractive. We dated for 2 years. I met his family on both sides, and they were warm and a little chaotic, and immediately treated me like I'd always been there. I brought him home to meet mine after about 6 months because I kept finding reasons to delay it, and at some point I had to admit to myself that I was afraid. My father is a corporate attorney, not a small-town one. He's a partner at a firm in Chicago that handles mergers and acquisitions for companies you would recognize. He grew up working class in Indiana, pulled himself out through law school on scholarships and sheer stubbornness, and somewhere along the way decided that the distance between where he came from and where he'd arrived needed to be maintained at all costs. He loves me. I've never doubted that. But his love has always come with a measuring stick, and everything in my life got held up against it. My mother is gentler, but she defers to him on almost everything. My younger sister, Gwendolyn, is the one who figured out early how to play the game. She married a finance guy who went to Northwestern. They live in a suburb my dad approves of, and every family dinner involves at least one moment where my dad references something my brother-in-law did and nods like it confirms something about the natural order of the world. I knew bringing Brennan home was going to be complicated. He was confident and kind and good at what he did, but he drove a beat-up truck. He talked about old buildings with the enthusiasm most people reserve for sports teams. And when my father inevitably asked where he went to school, the answer was going to be Ohio State, not Georgetown or Yale or the names my father collected like currency. The first dinner was at my parents' house in the north suburbs. My mother made a beautiful meal. My father shook Brennan's hand and asked what he did for a living. Brennan explained. Structural engineering, small firm, historic preservation focus, mostly commercial and residential projects in the Midwest. My father nodded slowly in the way he does when he's deciding how to categorize something. So renovation work, he said. Structural assessment and remediation mostly, Brennan said. Some new builds, but the preservation side is where we've carved out a niche. My father reached for the bread. Good to have a trade. Brennan didn't flinch. He just said, "It is," and moved on. I watched my father file that response somewhere, and I felt the first edge of dread settle in my chest. Over the next 2 years, before and after Brennan and I got married, my father found a dozen different ways to make clear that he considered Brennan beneath the family's expectations. He never said it directly. He was a lawyer. He was too good at language for that, but the grease monkey comment came after about 8 months of smaller cuts. Questions at dinner about whether Brennan's little firm was holding on okay. A moment at my cousin's wedding when my father introduced Brennan to a colleague as my daughter's husband. He does construction work. A Christmas where he gave Brennan a gift card to a hardware store while everyone else got something personal and considered. Every time I told myself it would get better, he was warming up slowly. He'd come around. He just needed time to see who Brennan actually was. What I didn't let myself fully acknowledge was that Brennan kept trying to show him and my father kept not looking. There was a dinner, maybe 18 months into our marriage, where the conversation turned to a high-profile building collapse that had been in the news. A parking structure in St. Louis that had failed during a storm, injured 6 people. My father was holding court about liability and litigation, which was fair enough, that was his word. Brennan started to say something about the engineering assessment that had reportedly been missed on the structure, a specific thing about the original design documents and what a competent review would have caught. My father talked right over him, didn't pause, didn't acknowledge, just continued his own tread, like Brennan hadn't spoken. I looked at Brennan, he met my eyes, gave the smallest shrug, and went back to his food. That shrug almost broke my heart more than anything else. He'd stopped expecting to be heard at that table. The breaking point came about 2.5 years into our marriage, in the spring. My father had been up for senior partnership elevation at his firm. Not a new partner, he was already that. But a move to the executive committee, which was a significant thing in the firm's structure. There was going to be a dinner to celebrate, a real one, not a family dinner, a private room at a downtown restaurant, senior partners and their spouses, some clients, the kind of event my father had been working toward for his entire career. He called me 3 weeks before. I remember I was in the middle of making dinner, and I saw his name on my phone, and I felt that familiar tightening. "I need to talk to you about the dinner," he said. "Okay," I said. "I think it would be better if you came alone." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because I genuinely didn't understand what he meant at first. "What do you mean, alone?" "These are senior partners, Olivia. Their spouses are executives and attorneys. Some of them are clients themselves. It's a very particular kind of evening. Brennan would be out of his element, and honestly, it would be distracting." I stood there in my kitchen, holding a wooden spoon, and felt the years of small humiliations stack up into something I could finally see clearly. "Distracting," I said. "You know what I mean." "I really don't, Dad. Can you say it plainly?" There was a pause. "He doesn't fit in those rooms, Olivia. That's not an insult, it's just reality. The man works with his hands. These people don't have anything to talk to him about. He's a structural engineer who owns his own firm. A small firm. Renovation work. Olivia, I'm not asking you to divorce him. I'm asking you to come to one dinner without making it complicated." I heard Brennan's truck pull into the driveway. "I'll call you back," I said, and hung up. I didn't call him back that night. I sat with it for 2 days. I talked to Gwendolyn, which surprised me. I hadn't expected much from that conversation, because Gwendolyn has always been careful about not getting between me and our father. But something had shifted in her. She'd had her own quiet reckoning about some things recently, and she was more honest with me than she'd ever been. "He's not going to change," she said. We were on the phone. She was whispering because her kids were asleep. "You know that, right? I've watched him do this to you for years, and I should have said something sooner, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for that. But he's not going to just wake up one day and see Brennan. He sees what he decides to see. So what do I do?" "You decide what you're willing to accept, and then you stop accepting anything else." I talked to Brennan that night. Actually talked, which sounds simple, but we'd gotten into the habit of handling my family as a shared inconvenience. We navigated around rather than something we addressed directly. I told him what my father had said, all of it word for word. He was quiet for a long time. "I knew," he said finally. "I've known for a while. I kept thinking if I just gave it enough time, showed up enough times, he'd at least see that I'm not going anywhere." "I'm sorry," I said. "I should have said something sooner." "You don't have to apologize for him." "I'm not apologizing for him. I'm apologizing for me, for not drawing the line earlier." I called my father back the next morning. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "I've thought about it," I said. "Good." His voice was already relaxing into relief. "I'm not coming without Brennan." Silence. "Olivia." "He's my husband, Dad." Anywhere he's not welcome, I'm not welcome either. That's not a negotiation. You're being dramatic. This is an important evening for me. I know it is. I hope it's wonderful. I hope the food is great and your partners say all the right things and you feel everything you've worked for. But I won't be there, and that's not me being dramatic. That's just where we are. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking. He didn't call back that day, or the next. My mother called carefully to say she hoped I'd reconsider, that my father was hurt, that I was making something bigger than it needed to be. I told her I loved her and I wasn't changing my mind. The dinner was on a Thursday. I made pasta at home and Brennan and I watched a movie, and it was a perfectly ordinary evening. Gwendolyn went. She told me afterward that our father had seemed distracted most of the night, that he'd kept checking his phone, which wasn't like him. What happened at that dinner, I found out in pieces over the following week. One of the senior partners, a woman named Lorraine who handled the firm's largest real estate litigation clients, had apparently spent part of the cocktail hour talking about a project she'd been loosely involved in. A developer client of hers was trying to acquire a property in Wicker Park, a 6-story commercial building from 1908 that the city had landmarked. There were significant questions about structural viability before any renovation financing could be approved, and the engineering firm they'd initially brought in had given a report that 2 other consultants had contradicted. The project had been stalled for 8 months. My father had apparently said something like, "That kind of situation is exactly where you need someone who really knows what they're looking at." Lorraine had said yes, and then she'd mentioned that she'd actually been trying to track down a specific engineer, someone who'd published work on load-bearing assessments in landmarked pre-war buildings, and she'd heard his firm operated in Chicago. My father, according to Gwendolyn, who was standing close enough to hear this, had gone very still. He said, "What's his name?" Lorraine said, "Brennan Cole. Have you heard of him?" And my father, my polished, controlled attorney father who had spent 3 years calling my husband a man who worked with his hands, said, Yes, I know who he is." He called me the following Tuesday. I was at work and I let it go to voicemail. His message was short and not quite an apology, but closer to one than I'd ever heard from him. He said he'd been wrong to ask me to come without Brennan. He said he'd like to have us both over for dinner when things settled down. He said, and I have to listen to this part twice, that he'd underestimated Brennan, and he knew that. I called Gwendolyn before I called him back. "Did he really say that?" I asked. "He did," she said. And Olivia Lorraine reached out to Brennan's firm directly the day after the dinner. Dad had nothing to do with it. She found him on her own. She just happened to mention it to Dad first. "Good," I said. "That's better, actually." I called my father back that evening. The conversation was short. I told him I appreciated him saying what he said. I told him we'd come to dinner, but that going forward Brennan would be introduced as a structural engineer and the founder of his firm. Not as someone who did renovation work, not as a man with a trade, as what he actually was. My father said, "Okay." That was it. Just okay. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't a movie ending where he gave a speech about how wrong he'd been, and we all hugged and something fundamental shifted. It was just a quiet, small okay. From a man who had needed something to cost him before he was willing to adjust. Lorraine and Brennan's firm ended up working together on the Wicker Park project. It took another 6 months to get through the assessment and the city approval process, but it went through. The building is being renovated right now. Brennan drives past it sometimes, and I can see him doing the math in his head, calculating things I don't fully understand, looking at a structure that most people would have torn down and seeing everything it still had to offer. I have a lot of feelings about my father that I'm still working through. I love him. I'm angry at him. I understand, in a way I wish I didn't, where the snobbery comes from and why he built it as carefully as he built everything else in his life. It was armor. The same way it is for a lot of people who climbed hard to get somewhere. He needed to believe the climb meant something, and he measured everyone else against it. That doesn't make it okay. It just makes it human. What I know is this: Brennan never needed my father's approval to be exactly who he was. He showed up to those dinners for years and got talked over and dismissed, and he handled it with more grace than I ever could have. And when the moment came that proved everything he was worth, he wasn't even in the room. He didn't have to be. The work spoke for itself, the way it always had, because that's the thing about people who are genuinely good at what they do. They don't need you to see it. The buildings they save are still standing whether you're paying attention or not. I keep coming back to that shrug, the one Brennan gave me at the dinner table after my father talked over him like he wasn't there. Such a small thing, just his shoulders lifting and dropping, and then he went back to his food. But I understood what it meant. He'd already decided not to waste energy fighting for a seat at a table that didn't want him there. He just kept doing the work. That's what I missed for too long. I was so focused on trying to change my father's mind that I didn't fully see what Brennan was actually doing. He wasn't waiting to be validated. He was out there doing assessments on buildings that everyone else had written off, writing papers that real engineers in his field were reading, building a reputation that had nothing to do with what my father thought of him at Sunday dinner. The outcome that eventually arrived, Lorraine knowing his name, his firm getting that call, that didn't come from the dinner table. It came from years of showing up and doing honest, serious work when nobody important was watching. I think about that a lot now. There's something I've come to believe pretty firmly. Character isn't built in the moments when someone's paying attention. It's built in all the quiet moments when they're not. Brennan could have gotten small and bitter under my father's dismissiveness. A lot of people would have. Instead, he just stayed exactly who he was. Curious, careful, committed to getting things right. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. My father's story is harder for me to sit with because I love him and because I understand him more than I sometimes want to. He built himself up from genuinely hard circumstances, and somewhere along the way he confused the ladder he climbed with the measure of a person's worth. He stopped being able to see that intelligence and capability take 100 different shapes, and that a man who understands how a building stays standing is no less sharp than a man who argues cases in a boardroom. That's not ignorance. That's a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. And choices like that have consequences, not dramatic, lightning bolt consequences, but the slow kind. The kind where a daughter stops trying to close the distance and a son-in-law stops trying to be seen. What I wish I had done sooner was draw the line earlier. Not because it would have changed my father faster. I don't think it would have, but because it would have shown Brennan more clearly that I was on his side. That's on me, and I've had to sit with that. What I know now is that the three things that actually move a life forward aren't titles or credentials or who you know. They're whether you treat people with basic decency, whether you keep developing your mind and your craft with genuine seriousness, and whether you have the stubbornness to keep going when the people who are supposed to believe in you don't. Brennan had all three the whole time. The rest eventually caught up. The building in Wicker Park is still standing. Someone, a long time ago, built it to last. All it needed was someone willing to look past what it appeared to be on the surface and see what it was actually made of.